Minister of Finance and Coordinating Minister of the Economy, Mr. Wale Edun, yesterday stressed the need for Nigeria and other developing countries who are implementing reforms and other forms of structural adjustment programs to ensure that the vulnerable populations in the respective countries are protected. Edun said this on the same day the International Monetary Fund, IMF, in its latest World Economic Outlook, WEO, report downgraded Nigeria's growth prospect for 2024 from 3.3% to 2.9%. Responding to this day's question during a media briefing of the Intergovernmental Group of 24, G24, on International Monetary Affairs and Development, which is a group of countries that includes members of the World Bank and IMF, as well as other developing countries. Edun noted that developing countries must focus on implementing sustainable reforms at the macroeconomic level while ensuring that the most vulnerable populations are protected from the immediate cost of these reforms. Also responding to a question on lessons Nigeria and other G24 countries implementing reforms have learned from the process, Edu, who doubles as the second vice chairman of the G24, said, "The key lesson that I think I will focus on is that in devising these programs and carrying out reforms, what is particularly important because the benefits are over the longer term and the costs are front-loaded is the social safety net that will help the poor and the vulnerable cope with the upfront cost, with a spike in their cost of living. It has to be adequately planned and dealt with. It shouldn't be a question of afterthought that you now decide that there needs to be a certain poverty alleviation initiatives linked to that or linked to helping the poor and most vulnerable. Another thing is communication. I think one of the critical things in carrying out these macroeconomic reforms that are so fundamental is communicating what is being done, what is to be expected, and also the timing of the various activities. So if it is a program to give direct benefit, direct transfer of funds to a group of people, then they should be published for everyone to understand. There should be a dashboard that people can follow, thereby engendering and building public trust. He underscored the importance of planning for social safety nets to help the poor and vulnerable cope with the immediate impact of such reforms, which often lead to a spike in the cost of living. Edun also reiterated that Nigeria's ability to address its ongoing foreign exchange crisis hinges on boosting crude oil production, even as he acknowledged challenges Nigeria was facing in managing FX supply. He also noted that Nigeria and other G24 countries will benefit more if multilateral institutions such as the World Bank and IMF increase fundings to not just to only meet immediate needs, but also pursue the long-term developmental needs of developing countries. We continue to ask for an improved global financial architecture that provides us with more concessional funding, particularly for those countries that, as I said earlier, are undertaking the macroeconomic reforms that everybody agrees are sensible and will lead to better lives for their people, he said. Furthermore, he pointed out that while interest rates were starting to ease in developed countries, many developing nations, including Nigeria, were still grappling with high inflation and elevated interest rates. This, he said, heightened the need for more concessional financing from multilateral institutions to make borrowing more affordable for developing economies. I think around this time last year, we were still dealing with heightened levels of inflation, particularly in the developed countries, and that meant elevated rates of interest as their number one priority, the fight against inflation and tight monetary policy by the central banks. That has changed, and there is now, as we have seen, monetary easing, or at least easing of rates of interest by central banks, but that's in the developed world. In the developing world, rates are still high, and that fight against inflation means that the interest rate will also remain high. But as far as the developed world is concerned, lower interest rates translate to more affordability. Nobody wants to borrow, nobody likes to borrow, but when it becomes necessary, it's something that must be managed as well as possible. And so the first port of call is concessional financing, either financing from the World Bank, the developing world countries, to call for the larger sums that can really make a difference, not just to be able to help a country cope with its immediate payment needs, but to have funds to grow the economies. That is what the fight against inflation translates to for the developing countries. He commended the recent 36% reduction in the IMF's borrowing costs, describing it as a step in the right direction to help developing countries manage their debt while assessing the resources needed for economic growth. Meanwhile, the IMF, in its latest World Economic Outlook (WEO) report, has downgraded Nigeria's growth prospect for 2024 from 3% to 2.9%. The WEO was released at the ongoing IMF and World Bank annual meetings in Washington, D.C., United States. The multilateral institution, however, raised its forecast for the West African country for 2025 to 3.2%. The adjustment reflected concerns over Nigeria's ongoing macroeconomic challenges, particularly the effect of recent flooding and oil production setbacks. The IMF attributed its downward revision of Nigeria to two major factors: agricultural disruption caused by several flooding and security and maintenance issues hampering oil production. These challenges, according to Division Chief in the IMF's Research Department, Jean-Marc Natal, who spoke during a media briefing on the WEO, were key drivers of the revision. Natal said, "There has been over the year and a half some progress in the region. You saw inflation stabilizing in some countries, going down even and reaching a level close to the target. So half of them are still at a large distance from the target, and a third of them are still having double-digit inflation. In terms of growth, it's quite uneven, but it remains too low. The other issue is that in the region, it is still high. It has stopped increasing, and in some countries already starting to consolidate, but it's still too high. And then the debt service is correspondingly still high in the region. There's been some progress in some terms of the recommendations in countries where inflation is very high. You would recommend tight monetary policy, and in some cases, when possible, help by consolidation on the fiscal side."